There is a specific kind of silence that happens after you've forgiven someone for the same thing a fourth time, or a fifth, or a number so high you've stopped counting. It isn't peaceful. It's the silence of someone quietly realizing they've said it's okay out loud, while something inside them was screaming that it wasn't. You forgave the broken promise. You forgave the forgotten birthday, the canceled plans, the cruel comment excused as a joke, the apology that arrived without any actual change behind it. And each time, you told yourself this was the last time you'd need to, right up until you were standing in the exact same spot again, forgiving the exact same thing, wondering, with a kind of exhausted disbelief, how you got here again. If you've ever caught yourself extending forgiveness you didn't actually feel, simply because offering it felt easier than the alternative, you already know this isn't really a story about forgiveness at all. It's a story about something forgiveness has been quietly covering up your entire life. We're taught that forgiveness is a virtue, and in most cases, it is. Psychologically, letting go of resentment tends to correlate with better mental health, lower stress, and stronger relationships. But somewhere along the way, forgiveness got confused with something else entirely, something that looks similar from the outside, but behaves completely differently underneath. Real forgiveness releases you from a wound. This other thing, the thing you've actually been practicing, keeps the wound open, dresses it up as maturity, and calls it love. And the first uncomfortable truth hiding inside this entire pattern is that you were never actually forgiving these people for what they did. You were forgiving them in advance for what they were about to do again. Carl Jung offers a starting point most people never expect, because it has nothing to do with the person who hurt you and everything to do with a much older relationship, one your conscious mind barely remembers forming. Jung believed that the emotional blueprint for how we tolerate being treated is assembled extraordinarily early, often before language, shaped by whichever caregivers held the most power over our sense of safety. If forgiveness in that original relationship was the price of continued closeness, if love came with conditions you learned to meet quietly rather than question openly, then forgiveness itself stops being a moral choice you make as an adult. It becomes a reflex, wired in before you had any say in the matter, activating automatically whenever a similar dynamic appears, regardless of whether the person in front of you deserves it. Picture a child who learns, across 1,000 small moments, that a parent's affection reliably returns after an outburst, an absence, a broken promise, as long as the child doesn't hold on to the hurt for too long. Holding a grudge in that house wasn't safe. It risked prolonging the very distance the child was desperate to close. So the child adapts, brilliantly, the way children always do. They learn to release the hurt quickly, sometimes before it's even been fully felt, because releasing it is what restores the connection. This isn't weakness, it's a strategy built under real constraint. But strategies built in childhood don't retire simply because the environment that required them eventually changes. They keep running quietly in adult relationships that look nothing like the original one, offering the same fast, automatic forgiveness to people who never earned the access that forgiveness grants them. Think about the last time you found yourself comforting someone else immediately after they hurt you, apologizing for your own reaction before they'd even finished explaining theirs. From the outside, this looks like extraordinary emotional generosity. From the inside, if you trace it back far enough, it often has a much older signature. The specific choreography of a child managing an adult's emotional state because the adult, for whatever reason, couldn't reliably manage it themselves. That choreography becomes so deeply practiced it eventually stops feeling like a strategy at all. It simply feels like who you are, a naturally forgiving person, when in truth you may be a person who was never given the option to be anything else. But that isn't the real problem. The real problem is what happens to your own perception once this reflex has been running long enough, because it doesn't just make you quick to forgive, it starts to actively distort what you believe you're forgiving in the first place. Watch closely the next time someone who has hurt you repeatedly offers an apology, and notice which details your mind emphasizes and which ones it quietly minimizes. Most people assume they're evaluating the apology objectively, weighing the words, the tone, the sincerity. In reality, a cognitive bias called motivated reasoning is often doing the evaluating for you, unconsciously steering your interpretation toward whatever conclusion allows you to stay connected to the person. Because staying connected, for a nervous system trained this early, feels like survival rather than preference. This is why an apology that would sound hollow and insufficient coming from a stranger can sound completely convincing coming from someone you're emotionally entangled with. You're not naive. Your mind is doing exactly what it was trained to do decades ago, finding the fastest route back to closeness, even when closeness is precisely the thing costing you the most. Notice, too, how selectively memory itself cooperates with this process. Ask yourself, honestly, how many specific instances you could list of this person's repeated harm if pressed right now in detail back to back, without softening any of them. Most people find this exercise surprisingly difficult, not because the instances didn't happen, but because the mind has a documented tendency to blur painful, repetitive experiences into a single vague impression rather than storing them as a sharp, cumulative record. This blurring isn't accidental. It's protective, in the sense that a mind forced to hold every instance in full, undiluted clarity would find continued closeness almost impossible to justify. So instead, the details soften. One apology bleeds into the general impression of who this person is rather than remaining evidence of a specific, repeated pattern, and the fifth betrayal starts to feel, absurdly, like the first one all over again. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath the surface of this pattern, though, and it explains why the cycle doesn't just repeat, it actually intensifies each time you complete it. Most people believe that forgiving someone who hurt them and then continuing to trust them are two separate decisions. In practice, for a person operating on this early installed reflex, they collapse into a single automatic action. And this collapse is reinforced by one of the most well-documented mechanisms in behavioral psychology, intermittent reinforcement, the same principle that makes slot machines more addictive than any game, with predictable, consistent payouts. A person who hurts you and then occasionally, unpredictably, offers real tenderness, genuine remorse, a version of themselves you keep hoping is the real one, is training your nervous system on precisely the schedule that produces the strongest, most persistent behavioral loops known to psychology. You're not forgiving them despite the inconsistency. Your brain is forgiving them, in part because of it, chasing the unpredictable reward with the same neural circuitry involved in gambling, convinced that the next round of closeness, if you just hold on a little longer, will finally be the one that sticks. Evolutionary psychology offers a reason this particular trap works so efficiently on people who are otherwise perfectly capable of sound judgment elsewhere in their lives. For most of human history, the cost of misjudging a close ally as permanently untrustworthy was extremely high, potential exile from the exact group your survival depended on. So the ancestral mind evolved a strong bias toward reconciliation, toward finding a path back to connection rather than permanently severing it. That bias made sense when your entire social world consisted of a small, interdependent tribe you couldn't simply replace. It makes far less sense now, in a world with billions of potential relationships, where the actual cost of releasing one specific person is nowhere near what it would have been on the savannah, even though the ancient part of your brain calculating the risk hasn't fully caught up to that fact. Alfred Adler's psychology adds a layer that feels almost uncomfortably personal because it turns the lens back onto your own reasons for staying, rather than their reasons for repeating the harm. Adler believed a significant portion of adult behavior is organized around unconscious goals we rarely examine directly, and one of the most common hidden goals behind chronic forgiveness is the preservation of hope itself, the specific, seductive hope that if you just remain patient enough, loving enough, forgiving enough, the person will finally become who you've always believed they could be. This hope isn't foolish. It's often rooted in something real you've genuinely seen in them, a capacity, a softness, a version of them that does exist, at least sometimes. But Adler's insight cuts deeper than sentiment. The hope itself has become the mechanism keeping you trapped. Because as long as you're holding out for who they could become, you never have to fully reckon with who they've consistently, demonstrably already shown you they are. This is where psychology becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because it means the story you've been telling yourself that you keep forgiving out of love, out of loyalty, out of the belief that people deserve chances, may be true, and also incomplete in a way that's been quietly costing you for years. Neuroscience offers a physical explanation for why letting go of this hope feels almost unbearable, even when logic says it should be a relief. Researchers studying attachment and loss have found that anticipating the potential end of an emotionally significant bond activates brain regions associated with physical pain, the same regions that respond to actual bodily injury. This is why walking away from someone who repeatedly hurts you doesn't feel like simple, clean relief, even when every rational part of you knows it should. Your brain is registering the loss of the relationship, and specifically the loss of the hope attached to it, as a genuine injury. Which means choosing not to forgive one more time isn't a small act of willpower. It's closer to choosing to sit with real physical discomfort on purpose for the sake of a future you can't yet fully see. Most people never notice what comes next because it operates quietly, disguised as personal growth rather than what it actually is, a slow erosion of your own credibility, even to yourself. Every time you forgive without any accompanying change in behavior, you are not only communicating something to the other person, you're absent-mindedly recorded, teaching yourself a lesson too. One, your own mind absorbs whether you intend it to or not, that your stated limits are negotiable, that your own words carry less weight than your desire to avoid conflict. This matters far beyond any single relationship, because a person who has quietly taught themselves that their boundaries are decorative rather than real tends to carry that same self-doubt into every other area of life, hesitating to trust their own judgment even in situations that have nothing to do with the original pattern at all. Consider the specific moment you tell someone, with full sincerity, "This is the last time," and notice what happens the next time a similar moment arrives. If the promise wasn't kept, something subtle but corrosive occurs beneath conscious awareness. your own future declarations start to carry less internal weight because some part of you now knows, from direct experience, that your stated limits function more like opening offers in a negotiation than like actual boundaries. This is how a person can end up simultaneously furious at someone else's behavior and quietly unable to trust their own resolve, not because their resolve is weak, but because it has been systematically undermined by its own history of reversal, one well-intentioned exception at a time. Here is where Stoic philosophy draws a distinction sharp enough to finally separate forgiveness from its imitation. Seneca argued that a wise person forgives freely, but is never foolish about who they extend continued trust to, treating forgiveness and access as two entirely separate decisions rather than one automatic package deal. Epictetus went further, insisting that dignity requires distinguishing clearly between what you owe someone morally, compassion, understanding, the refusal to hold permanent contempt, and what you owe them practically, your continued time, vulnerability, and presence, which are never owed to anyone regardless of how much history exists between you. Marcus Aurelius, in his own private reflections, repeatedly reminded himself that a person's failure to change was information about them, not an obligation for him to keep absorbing indefinitely on their behalf. This distinction reframes the entire dilemma. You can release genuine resentment toward someone, wish them no active harm, even hope quietly for their growth, while still deciding, with total moral clarity, that you will no longer remain close enough to be hurt by them again. Forgiveness in this framing was never required to include continued access. Somewhere along the way, most people were simply never taught they were allowed to separate the two. Viktor Frankl's psychology offers something crucial for what happens after you finally make that separation. Because choosing not to forgive automatically for the first time in a pattern that's repeated for years often produces an unexpected wave of guilt rather than the relief you were promised. Frankl observed that human beings can tolerate difficult choices far more easily when those choices are anchored in genuine meaning rather than simple avoidance. And the meaning available here is specific. Withholding automatic forgiveness isn't cruelty, and it isn't the abandonment of your values. It's the first time your compassion has been paired with discernment instead of habit, which means it's actually a more mature, more considered form of the same virtue you've always believed in, not a betrayal of it. The next realization changes everything, because it reveals what real forgiveness, the kind that actually heals rather than the kind that quietly perpetuates harm, requires that the automatic version never did. Jung believed genuine psychological integration doesn't come from suppressing a pattern or fighting it directly, but from becoming fully conscious of it, understanding exactly where it came from and what function it currently serves, because a pattern operating outside your awareness will keep running indefinitely, while a pattern you've fully seen finally becomes something you can choose to interrupt. Real forgiveness, examine this closely, isn't fast. It isn't automatic. It's a decision made in full possession of the facts, including the fact that this person may never change, and it can coexist, uncomfortably but genuinely, with the decision to still walk away. Imagine, for a moment, what it would feel like to forgive someone completely, releasing every trace of resentment toward them as a person, while simultaneously closing the door on any further access to your time and attention, without those two decisions feeling contradictory. This isn't coldness, it's precision, the kind that only becomes possible once you've stopped conflating a feeling you owe no one with an access that was never actually required. The relief that follows isn't the relief of vindication. It's quieter than that, closer to the specific feeling of finally putting down something heavy you'd forgotten you were still carrying, one you'd started to believe was simply a permanent part of your body. None of this happens in a single decisive moment, and Jung would have been the first to insist on that. The old reflex will surface again, probably during a moment of genuine tenderness, a message that finally sounds like the person you always believed was in there. That resurgence isn't failure, it's simply the old pattern, still running its outdated programming, gradually losing its grip each time you notice the pull and choose, deliberately, to respond to the pattern rather than obey it. What changes first is never the pull itself. It's the space that now exists between feeling it and acting on it. And that space, small and unglamorous as it looks from the outside, is the entire difference between a person who forgives the same wound for another decade and a person who finally, quietly stops. There is, importantly, a difference between this kind of stopping and simply becoming unable to forgive at all. A person who has done this work doesn't lose the capacity for grace. If anything, their forgiveness becomes more available, not less, precisely because it's no longer being extracted under duress from an exhausted, overextended nervous system. What they lose is only the automatic, unexamined version, the one that arrived before any real evaluation had even taken place. What replaces it is something closer to genuine choice, forgiveness offered on purpose, to people who have shown through consistent behavior that it will be met with something other than repetition. And this leaves you with the only question that actually matters, the one no advice about boundaries can fully answer for you. If the forgiveness you've been offering was never really about them, if it was always the echo of a much older bargain you made as a child to stay safe and stay loved, then what might it look like to finally forgive from a place of genuine choice rather than old necessity? And who might you become the moment your compassion stops requiring you to stay? If this kind of psychology, the kind that reveals what's actually running beneath your most familiar habits, is something you want more of, consider staying close. There's more of this coming, built for people who'd rather understand the pattern than keep forgiving their way back into it.